Good afternoon and welcome. Good to see such a good turnout on a summer's day. I'm Roger Mark D'Souza, and I direct our Environmental Change and Security Program here at the Wilson Center. And this year, the program is celebrating our 20th anniversary. So time flies when you're having fun. The program looks at various connections between health, environment, livelihoods, population, and security. And most recently, we've had a number of events, and historically a number of events on climate change. We're supported by USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. And I'm really excited about today's event. I've been working on it with my colleague and our visiting fellow, Ruth Greenspan-Bell. And I wanted to thank Ruth for working with us today on this program. As some of you may know, we have a staff of about 150 people here at the Wilson Center. And every year we bring on an additional 150 people. And those people are fellows who come and work with us and do research and work on books. And they collaborate quite closely with our programs. So Ruth is one of these fellows that we have working with us here. Many of you also know that the Wilson Center is a living memorial to President Wilson, sort of bringing together these communities of analysis, policy relevance, programmatic applications, and practice. So today, we're going to be focusing on how do we move beyond talking about just silver bullets as a solution to climate change, and to focus on how we can move to beyond an exclusive reliance on either comprehensive domestic legislation in the United States or major international agreement led by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We want to talk a little bit about silver buckshots, and we'll offer some perspectives on where we think that term came from, but focusing on smaller scale, bottom-up alternatives to these formal processes. But it was interesting, as Ruth and I were talking about the event today, we were commenting on some media coverage on these issues, and Paul Krugman has recently written a piece looking at the Sunday Times op-ed where there was some conversation about a carbon tax, and basically saying that this is a great idea, it's unlikely to happen given politics, but then there are various second best approaches. And Ruth was emphasizing for me, and she was saying, I don't know why he's calling these second best approaches. This is exactly what we want to talk about today, that these are not necessarily second best. Rather, they are diversified approaches that are appropriate to the complexity of the task at hand. So that is what we want to talk about today. And we have three wonderful speakers who will be helping us think about those issues. We're going to start with Ruth, who is going to lay out some of the major perspectives in terms of moving beyond just the UNFCCC. She's a public policy fellow scholar here at the Wilson Center, and she focuses on the governance aspects of managing pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, and previously has worked as a senior fellow and director of the U.S. Climate Policy Objective at the World Resources Institute, has directed international institutional development and environmental assistance at Resources for the Future, and has served as a senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. So, Ruth, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Are you guys going to sit or stand?
Why don't you stand?
There's a clicker right here.
Oh, okay. I may need instruction. Now, let's see. Great, and then I just move this down like that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming today. I'm really glad to see this nice audience, and thank you, Roger Mark, who's always been extremely welcoming and supportive of the things we're trying to do. When we get to Elka's presentation, we'll talk a little bit more about a joint project we have that joins Wilson Center and Columbia University Business School, where Elka teaches, to think about how behavioral approaches might facilitate and expedite and aid the process toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Oh, is that better? Yes. Okay. Well, I think you heard enough. I'm not going to repeat what I said. Climate change, it's a simple couple words, climate change and global warming, but what it's really all about is how we manage energy. And we manage energy 24/7. We consume it, we use it. It's an integral part of our life. It's an integral part of your life whether you're in the developing world or whether you live in the United States or Western Europe. Maybe we're a little bit more reliant on energy here than folks elsewhere, but what we're talking about when we're talking about trying to get a handle on this problem is trying to unravel or restructure almost every habit we have in our lives. I mean, it's a daunting task, but we have to be real about what's involved here. And as a result, I personally started thinking a few years ago about this sort of push for grand policy, either globally or domestically, where we were trying to get legislation. And I do believe that that is necessary, but I also think that maybe we've been a little focused on getting big silver bullets out there without thinking about the multiple ways that we can and should address these issues, being more realistic about the kind of challenges we face. A number of years ago, a very wise person wrote an article that I read a long time ago called The Science of Muddling Through. And basically what he was talking about was that complex problem solving requires skillful incrementalism. And that's really what we're trying to talk about today, the various ways that you can address these issues incrementally, being opportunistic in some kinds of situations, really trying to find multiple pathways toward resolving this huge challenge that has been thrown somehow or other at humanity. So I'm going to try to change that. Okay. We know that we know something about the complexity of the task ahead. I'm going to focus, by the way, just on the international part of it. I'm going to talk about international buckshot, and it is built on some work I've been doing over the last 3, 4, 5 years, which I will talk about in more history and in more detail. And at the very end of the talk, I have a bibliography if you're interested in doing a bit more reading in this subject. So, we know that we, frankly, despite all the talk, we haven't really made much of a dent in greenhouse gas emissions. Globally, they're rising. It's a dangerous situation. All you have to do is read the IPCC report, and there's some serious stuff there. But then, as I said earlier, I think the other issue is somehow getting, thinking a little bit more about the complexity of the issue, but how you might get your hands around those different complexities. And what I started looking at a few years ago is whether there might be other models for getting to global agreement. We know we need to coordinate a lot of countries. We know that this can't be done alone, and I won't get into that. I know there are fights about whether the U.S. should step out or other countries should step out. That's a whole other subject matter that somebody else can discuss. But regardless, we know it's a big global issue, and it requires some sort of global solutions. And thus far, we have really invested pretty much all of our energy and determination into the UN process. So the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has been the principal vehicle for trying to get people together and try to do something about the problem. What we looked at and published about was whether there might be other models out there, whether a single agreement is the only way you do it, or whether there are other ways of sort of teasing out agreements where they're possible and making progress even in difficult circumstances. And the model we liked the best when we looked at a bunch of different models was the history of weapons negotiations. And I will go into that in more detail, but I just want to make one upfront clear statement. What I'm saying is not, and the history, of weapons negotiations is not a template. It's not a a set of steps cast in concrete. It's a series of ideas, which I would hope would kind of help people to kind of loosen up their thought processes a little bit and think about alternative ways that global agreement can be nurtured along and made. So what I'm going to do is give you a series of examples of how to make Buckshot actionable internationally using the weapons world as a case example. So the weapons and climate worlds share some sort of interesting history, and in the weapons world, discussions initially were concentrated in the United Nations. And the ambitions that were expressed were huge. They were very lofty. The idea was to try to get general and complete disarmament, which is a pretty ambitious goal. And as early as 1947, there were proposals that would place all of the world's nuclear materials and facilities under UN control. So that was the initial framework that was framing the nuclear discussions in the beginning. Similarly, the climate objective, which is quoted here, sets a very ambitious standard. It's stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So those are the goals that we've set for ourselves. In the nuclear situation, discussions continued for quite a long time, again in the UN, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. And I don't want to exaggerate it too much, but basically it was kind of a wake-up call, a kind of a demonstration of the existential challenge that humanity faced. And then within more or less the same time frame, another interesting example, another interesting thing happened. China, which was then a very impoverished and supposedly backward country, developed nuclear capability. So these two were, serious wake-up calls. In the climate world, if we're trying to parallel these, we now know a whole lot more than we knew in 1992 or just before when we started this process. The science seems to be moving a great deal more quickly than we, previously had estimated. One interesting example is the Arctic. The original projections had Arctic sea ice through the century, and they've been reeling that back, and now there's some debate about whether the Arctic will be ice-free within decades. So there's, we're learning a lot, and we're learning that we're facing a serious crisis. This is not something that should be deferred. And then another interesting parallel with the nuclear, India and China, which when these discussions started were fairly poor countries, have become major greenhouse gas emitters. They're in the big leagues now on this issue. So my next slide is just kind of an overview of some points I'm going to make, how learning from the weapons world could be incorporated or could inform a more creative way of dealing with the climate issues. Open more lines of discussion and communication, the possibility of creating narrower institutions, focusing on specific problems rather than trying to continue to herd 195 parties in the same direction. The possibility of demonstrating smaller measures of progress as a way of creating stepping stones toward bigger ones. When you do that, you develop mutual trust, you develop a body of experience that people start to feel comfortable with. You can show progress can be made without some of the major players, and I'll explain that in a moment. And setting up a different kind of framework can sometimes mean that the parties involved can be flexible enough to respond to unexpected opportunities that come up along the way. And I think, with this, what I know a little bit challengingly call a lumbering UNFCCC process with its huge bureaucracy and its kind of difficulty of even moving from one step to another, this flexibility is less likely. So one way of approaching this is to kind of peel off issues and resolve issues that you can solve now, not trying to do the whole bucket of issues right away. And as I mentioned, the Cuban Missile Crisis kind of focused people's minds, and the result that came out of that was the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty. It prohibited atmospheric testing and testing in the oceans, and it was capable, they could put this into place because the means of verification were available. So the countries signing this agreement could feel comfortable that there was some substance, that this wasn't for show, it was really going to happen. So the lessons we took from this is separate out specific elements that can be ripe for resolution. You can deal with part of a problem, not the whole problem. It took 33 additional years to complete a comprehensive test ban, and small concrete steps really help. In this case, they reduced the damage that came from fallout from atmospheric testing, and that was not an insignificant achievement, and it also had the nice aspect of showing that, actually demonstrating that you could come to some agreements and they could be successful. Work with willing partners and lead by example. There have been treaties that have been, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is one example, that have been put together and managed even when major players have chosen not to engage in the process. So the willing parties to this have moved forward, have created agreements. Interestingly, and often they have moved eventually towards universal participation. The NPT has been very successful, but the US and the USSR didn't really engage seriously until China's testing in '64. And the proof of the pudding here is that, of course, we do have nuclear powers, but we have far fewer nuclear powers today than was predicted in the year, predicted by 2000. So there are 9, as most informed people thought there would be something like 25 nuclear powers by then. The lessons that we take from this is, even if you can't get some of the key players in, if you can get enough players in, then you can start setting a certain tone and you can start setting a certain international standard, and often outliers will join in later. It's really useful to leverage precipitating events. Certainly there's a lot going on in the climate world these days that you would think could be leveraged. One of the interesting examples in the climate world is that 49 of the poorest countries, about, 6 months, a year ago, said that they would cut their greenhouse gas emissions, even though they're responsible for only a tiny handful of what's going up there. But they decided they would take a follow us kind of approach. Rather than waiting for the big powers to do something, they would say, this is an important moral and political issue, and we're just going to step out and do this. The next lesson is to explore a variety of venues. As I said earlier, talks started in the UN, but then they moved to a specialized UN agency. Eventually that was paralyzed, but there have been productive other kinds of interactions, most interestingly regional agreements in which various regions of the world have made themselves nuclear weapon free. So, you know, it's piecing out the problem. There's a big emphasis in the UNFCCC process on, are countries going to ratify, are they going to formally join to the agreements? There is an interesting history in the weapons world that often agreements have not been ratified, and yet they have been followed. So, I mean, you know, let's be honest. In the United States, if we can't get through a treaty that is the treaty concerning persons with disabilities, a treaty that was specifically modeled on U.S. law, and the U.S. Senate decided not to ratify it, despite the fact that Senator Dole came in a wheelchair and urged them to do it. It seems very unlikely we're going to ratify a climate agreement. But if you set out the standards, it's certainly possible, as we learned from the Copenhagen COP, that we can start developing standards that, you know, that will fit that model, even if we aren't formally signed on to it. The important thing is, you know, substance, not procedure. It's really important to remember the history of the USSR and the U.S. in the nuclear business. We were together the principal owners of most nuclear weapons, and we had more than 40 years of bilateral arms negotiations that eventually led to reducing stockpiles very significantly. They still exist, they still make you nervous, but we were able to make some real progress on it. Not only that, but because of this relationship that had developed over such a long period of time, when the USSR fell apart, the U.S. and the USSR and the remnants of it were able very quickly to put into place some various safeguards for nuclear weapons, which had previously been, you know, spread through the entire Soviet Union. And it was those relationships and the abilities of Gorbachev and President Bush to actually do something about this that was very constructive. And there were other things they worked on too, including keeping nuclear scientists in Russia employed so they wouldn't take their expertise out and sell it to rogue nations. So, and that was largely based on the relationships that had been developed over a very long period of time between the countries. But, you know, the parallel between that and the climate situation is pretty obvious. There are really a handful of countries that produce the most greenhouse gases. And, you know, wouldn't it be productive to see whether there are discussions that could take place between that handful of countries? Do you really need the whole world to come to an agreement on that when you're talking about a more narrow band of people who bear such a big responsibility? There's a long history, which I won't go into in a lot of detail, of subsidiary specialized bodies being set up internationally and then taking responsibility and then being able to expand their responsibilities and expand their actions over time just by demonstrating competence and building trust. So the International Atomic Energy Agency has over time developed a wider and wider competence in its area. And it stands alone and doesn't get involved with all the other nuclear issues. It's basically monitoring declared peaceful nuclear facilities. And so there's some other examples of this too. And that possibility of sort of slicing off problems and sending them to a specialized agency is certainly something that one could think about in the climate situation. Monitoring various kinds of other interactions might be split off to a specialized agency. And the main lesson, I think, is that by building incrementally, by doing this sort of, you know, skillful incrementalism, you can build the kind of experience and the kind of mutual trust that is necessary in order to move to greater and greater stringency. So that's really ultimately the basis of how countries interact with each other. Can they believe each other? Can they trust each other to take these actions that they've pledged to do? And the idea behind the weapons history as it worked out is that level of trust was built through these various interactions, crisscrossing, the ability to make agreements that were verifiable, build on them, show how they could really work, and then, and elaborate and elaborate. I'm going to make one final pitch that's not necessarily a silver buckshot pitch, but it bothers me a lot that that the climate issue is in what I call the environmental ghetto. I worked for a lot of years with countries around the world. The environment minister and the environment ministry were usually the weakest and least powerful government agencies in the country. I mean, they were frequently a place where if you had to form a coalition government, you gave that minister position to some person just to make them happy. The fact that climate change is labeled as an environmental issue is, I think, very distressing, and I think reinforces that sort of sense that this isn't quite the important issue it should be. Sherry will talk about this in much greater detail, but the ability to bring power people to the table to talk about this as what it really is, a security challenge, a health challenge, a food security issue, you name it. It's an infrastructure issue, cities and how they function, I think is really important. And I would hope that by kind of diversifying the discussion and relabeling it and talking about what it is, we could bring more people to the table than we have now, and Sherry's been a leader in doing that, very, very important thing. So that is my part of the International Buckshot discussion, and I will turn it over to the next panelist.
Great, thank you very much, Ruth. Very much appreciated sort of the way that you have set out the series of ideas, as you mentioned, not a template, but once again, a series of ideas. And you talk about this in terms of skillful incrementalism and multiple pathways. So we really sort of saw that coming forth. I look forward to how we can continue to think about getting climate change out of the environmental ghetto, as you call it, an interesting way of framing it. So I hope that we'll get to some of that as we get to the question and answer. So I'd like to now introduce you to Elke Weber, is the Jerome A. Chazin Professor of International Business, a Professor of Psychology, and an Earth Institute Professor at Columbia University. And together with Ruth, she coordinates the U.S. National Science Foundation Research Coordination Network for the utilization of social science research on sustainability and energy. She's the lead author in Working Group 3 for the 5th Assessment Report of the IPCC. So, Elke?
Thank you so much, Roger. Mark. Can we cue up the other set of slides? I just want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center and Roger Mark in particular for hosting us here. And also Ruth for working with me the last 3 years on this project. As you know, I'm a psychologist by training, and I will sort of add to the silver buckshot analogy by talking about what I essentially consider the behavioral bullet. And so, as Ruth already pointed out to us, there really are no single solutions that will get us out of the climate change social challenge that we are facing for the next, hopefully, hundreds of years. International agreements clearly will be needed, so would need to be advanced. And I think Ruth sort of pointed us in a direction that might make them more productive. At the same time, national and state level regulation has to be in place. and many of you in this room probably sort of play a role in that process. Technological innovation is an important component in the set of tools, but technologies need to be adopted. Sort of it's great to develop them, but if they're sitting on the shelf and they're not being used, they're not much help. Economic carrots and sticks clearly play a role. Yes, we need a carbon fee of some sort, whether you want to call it a carbon tax or something else. Yes, it remains to be seen. But all of these solutions, all of these components come with costs and come with limitations. Some of them are expensive economically, some of them are expensive politically. And so the question is, can we add something else to that list of components? The silver buckshot analogy, a metaphor, sort of comes out of this idea of stabilization wedges that were popularized back in 2004 by an influential article by Pakala and Sokolow. And the general notion is that we need to have action on all of these fronts. It's not just one or the other that needs to be privileged. Clearly, different groups, different components will be working on these different solutions. But the effects need to be additive because any single wedge doesn't get us to the goal. They have to be sort of added together. The point I want to make for the behavioral wedge is that the behavioral wedge clearly also is an additive component in this set of approaches. If we all consume less energy, if we buy more energy efficient refrigerators, if the Navy sort of basically procures more energy efficient weapon systems, that will help and will reduce our emissions. But at the same time, I think the behavioral bullet or buckshot set of tools also will help us on these other fronts. In other words, understanding more about what people do and why they do it, rather than assuming that we are rational and using rational expectations when we set our policy, both levels and implementation targets, it's not going to get us very far. So understanding how people actually make this decision, so why we don't do things that intellectually we know we should be doing. And it's not just in the climate domain. We do it every day. And we should be dieting, but we don't. We eat that piece of cake after all. We should be saving for our pension and retirement, and we buy the car or the boat instead. So these trade-offs between sort of what's convenient in the here and now, and is very salient in our horizon, as opposed to goals and targets that are ultimately very important to us, but are in the future, are much more uncertain. That's just part of parcel of our life. And I think if we can solve the climate issue and the climate change decisions, I think everything else is icing on the cake. So with sort of that background, let me just sort of tell you a little bit about what kind of behavioral approaches I have in mind. It's just a small sampler, and at the very end, I will point you to a climate change communications guide that one of my centers has been publishing, which will give you many more references if you want to follow up on some of this. But to make my points, let me use the energy efficiency paradox as an example. The energy efficiency paradox is called a paradox because there are lots of technologies out there, whether it's heating and cooling systems, whether it's car and transportation technologies, that actually do pay in the long run. In other words, they have negative expected value. You pay for it up front, but over the lifetime of the device, of the investment, it pays off many times over. And so the economic costs are clearly sort of in their favor. And yet the paradox is that these gains, these wins are not being realized. People are reluctant to engage, or they undersubscribe to these technologies. And I won't repeat the statistics, but what's being left on the table, and this has been documented by McKinsey and many other groups, is really in both staggering, both in terms of dollars and cents and in terms of the CO2 emissions we could be saving. So it could be the equivalent of taking all US cars and light trucks off the road, for example. So why aren't we utilizing what seems like a win-win-win opportunity? On the one hand, we have financial gains for the consumers of these technologies. There's societal gains for the environment because we are reducing CO2 emissions. And there's reduced need for new power generation facilities for utility providers. And as you know, they have a hard time building new facilities. Nobody wants to have these new plants in their backyard. So why aren't we doing it? And this slide, you've probably seen this graph many times. But on the left-hand side here, the technologies on the left, which includes heating, cooling, lighting technologies, those are the ones that are being left on the table. They have negative abatement costs, and yet they're not being adopted sufficiently. So what do we do about this paradox? Well, there clearly are political solutions, there are economic solutions. And so we can regulate efficiency. Building codes, are one avenue to do that. Energy efficiency standards, the new CAFE standards that were being put in place by our current administration go a long way to help out on that. If you're a country like Germany, we don't like to just sort of have standards. We just take inefficient things off the table. I'm also German. I'm American and German. But what happened in Germany, basically, sort of people started hoarding the old incandescent light bulbs because we don't like to give up on our sort of the technologies that we know. And so that has costs as well. In terms of economic solutions, yes, carbon tax is a good idea. We have to raise the price of energy. A carbon fee of some sort actually will help, and not to be knocked, what they call it a tax or a cap and trade solution. And also we can subsidize new technologies, and we already are doing that to some extent. All of these are great solutions. But what I want to sort of add to this list of approaches, of tools, are some behavioral interventions. So how can we help people make decisions that they know are ultimately in their own best interest, but yet sort of we're being prevented by our cognitive and by our emotional limitations from taking advantage of those? Well, if you wanted some treatments, it oftentimes helps to have a diagnosis. And so each of these bullets, each of these interventions sort of comes with a small diagnosis. I could go into much more detail on that. Maybe we can do that in the question period. But certainly our actions oftentimes are guided by what the default option is. Oftentimes the default option is what we currently are doing. We all stick in the muds. We like our current word processing system. Somebody comes up with an update, and we know ultimately sort of it would be better for us. But I personally don't like change. And so I stick with my old system until somebody tells me I can't do that. Now these days I listen to my husband or to my IT guy, and I do what they tell me to. But if you take sort of the diagnosis as a guidance towards a treatment, well, then we should be telling people that the default is not necessarily the old way of doing it, but makes the new way of doing it the default. And what's nice about default options, it doesn't take any choice autonomy off the table. Just by saying something is being put in place for you, and if you want to change it, you're free to do that. Doesn't mean that you can't go back to the old technology. In a building code, the default option could be the CFL bulb. So we did a study on that. Some colleagues of mine at Columbia a couple of years ago, and basically you can't read this small print. I'm just going to read it to you. You're told that you have recently renovated part of your house. The contractor has put in either the incandescent bulb or the CFL bulb already in that housing tract. If you want to change it, that's fine, and the contractor will just basically change it back to the other at no cost to you. Then the question is, are you saying, okay, I'm going to stick with what the contractor has done already, or do I want to tell him to change to the other technology? Okay, so very simple. Half of the people were being told the contractor puts the CFL bulbs in, and the other half are being told the contractor puts the incandescent bulbs in. So does it make a difference what the default option is? As you can see here, yes, it makes a huge difference. If the incandescent bulb is the default option, 44% actually sort of stick with it. But if the CFL bulb is the default option, 20% actually stick with the incandescent. In other words, 20% go back, 80% stick with the better technology. So this is a large saving. We see this in lots of other domains. Default effects have been demonstrated, for example, in organ donations. Half European countries are opt-in countries, like the way the United States is. You're not an organ donor unless you declare otherwise. The other half, and oftentimes neighboring nations, are opt-out countries. You are a donor unless you declare otherwise. And both the difference in willingness to donate and in actual organ transplantations is staggering. So default options help because for a variety of reasons. Default options tend to have some implicit endorsement. Your government must be knowing what's best for you by recommending that being the default option. We're cognitively lazy. We tend to stick with sort of what's in place. And so it's probably an overdetermined phenomenon, but it's a powerful one. And I would argue it's a recipe for how to get people to be more likely to accept change. Okay, let's look at another example and another diagnosis. There's also something about attention. Old options attract our attention, attractive labels attract our attention. Marketing is all about attracting attention to the kinds of services or goods that the companies want us to buy. And so how can we direct attention to those options that might be in our long-term financial and environmental interests? Well, a number of years ago, actually, let me go back. A number of years ago, I was puzzled by the fact that Americans hate carbon taxes. At the same time, the uptake of carbon offsets, those are the kinds of indulgences that you can buy for flying on airplanes or consuming carbon energy in other ways, the uptake has been doubling in the years that they've been in operation. And so we basically gave people a choice between different products. One of them was an airplane ticket from New York City to California. They could either just buy the ticket, and we had the actual amount of money for that, or they could buy the ticket including the carbon fee. There were a couple of pages of text about why the fee was the amount it was, how it was going to be used to offset their transportation carbon emissions and so on. And this came right off the websites of these providers of offsets. The only thing that differed between the two groups, half the people being told this was a carbon tax, and half of them were being told it was a carbon offset. But in both cases, it was clear that it was a carbon fee. Now, the question was, and of course the carbon tax is a dirty word, and the question was, would it make a difference how we labeled the fee, a tax or an offset? At the end of the study, we also asked people to type out loud what went through their mind as they made this decision, and we can maybe talk about sort of the use of those arguments in the question period. But at the end, we also asked them lots of personal questions about themselves, gender, income level, and so on, including self-proclaimed political affiliation, Democratic, Independent, or Republican. And as you can see, when the carbon fee was labeled a carbon offset, it didn't make any difference who they were in terms of political affiliation. But 67% of people took the ticket that included the fee. When this was, the fee was labeled a carbon tax, as you can see, it made no difference to the Democrats, but for Republicans, the uptake of that option went down to 27%, and the independents were right in between. So, what we did with those arguments, what goes through as you made the decision, we used those to see which options people considered first, and whether they generated arguments for or against it. Turns out when Republicans saw the word carbon tax, they immediately switched to the option that didn't include that word. And so attractive labels attract attention, aversive labels direct attention away to everything but that option. It turns out whatever option you look at first, you generate arguments for, and that drives your choice. And so the initial focus of attention is very important, and we can promote that focus by making those options that we want people to consider first attractive in lots of ways, including the option labels. Okay, tool number 3. It helps people to make a decision, even a decision for their own consumption of energy in a group context. And so, for example, if you ask people to choose between green electricity or gray electricity on their personal utility bill, and they make the decision on a Friday afternoon when they come home from work at the kitchen table, they're much, much less likely to choose the green electricity, which costs another 10 cents per kilowatt hour. But if they make the decision in the context of a condo meeting or a neighborhood meeting with some pizza, and they have lots of other people in the room around them, the same decision for their own personal energy consumption is much more in favor of green electricity. Now, why would that be? Well, if there's something about the presence of other people in the room that reminds you of the fact that you're not alone in the world, that your actions influence other people, affect other people around you. And so the social values and the social goals that you have get activated, get primed. And and we all have a bunch of values and goals, oftentimes conflicting ones. It's important that it's only the values that are active at the time of decision that influence your decision. And so basically helping people by the context, including social context, or icons of planet Earth, anything that sort of reminds you of the fact that we are living in a finite world where our actions affect those consequences for others, are more likely to elicit those values that make us more foresightful and having a more social and long-term time horizon and make decisions accordingly. The last point I want to make here is that also it helps to have metrics. It helps to have mental accounts. A few years ago, nobody knew what a carbon footprint was. These days, actually, it shows up in New Yorker cartoons, and you know when something's in a New Yorker cartoon, it has arrived. This one says, "Sorry, Harold, but I'm reducing our carbon footprint," and she holds a gun to her head. My husband doesn't think this is actually very funny. But the point is that we pay attention, again, this has to do with attention, we pay attention to those things that we can measure. Also, when we can measure something, we can measure progress. The metric introduces a goal for us. All of a sudden, the new goal is to reduce our carbon footprint. If we can measure it and keep track of that, we can make progress towards that goal. And actually sort of getting better at something is a very basic human need and a very strong motivator. That's why we all, or many of us, love to play video games, because in the next round, there's always the prospect of doing a little bit better than that. And I have some friends who have Toyota's Priuses, and there's this little dashboard display, like online, real-time feedback on how you're doing. Sometimes I'm afraid to drive with my friends because I pay more attention to that little display than to the traffic outside. But it's another example of sort of how you can use attention and attention to environmental goals and to environmental options as an intervention, as a measure to help people achieve their long-term objectives. So, in conclusions, I think sort of this whole session has to do with, but not taking away from the importance of individual interventions, but we really need to think silver buckshot and not just silver bullets. If we don't make progress on one front, let's move to a different front and let's try to make progress on all of these dimensions, political, economic, and behavioral. I think behavioral buckshot has been underutilized, vastly underutilized. It oftentimes is a missing wedge in our portfolio of approaches. And as a point I made initially, it's not just an additive wedge, it's also something that can make all of our other approaches, whether it's certain kinds of regulations that might assume that people are rational calculators of costs and benefits. Well, they aren't. And we know how how their naive calculations deviate from the rational ones. Well, knowing how they do allows us to design better kinds of incentives, economic incentives, or to implement them in more productive and more effective ways. And similarly with sort of political and other economic interventions. So let me just sort of finish by acknowledging National Science Foundation grants that have supported my work and those of my colleagues, and also with the URL to the Climate Change Communications Guide I mentioned to you initially. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alki. It was very good to sort of have a sense of the behavioral bullet and for you to walk us through the energy paradox and get the efficiency paradox and get to thinking about political and economic solutions and a number of examples of behavioral interventions. I particularly like the default option one. I know as a parent, that is a technique that I have used often. So it is something that we use in other aspects of our life. I'd like to now introduce you to a very good friend of the Wilson Center. Sherry Goodman is the Senior Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of CNA, a nonprofit research organization that provides analyses to national security and public sector organizations. She's the founder and executive director of the CNA Military Advisory Board, and they have released 2 landmark reports on national security, climate change, and accelerating risks. And we most recently helped launch the last report here, and it's available for you on the table just outside the room. So be sure to get a copy of that if you haven't. So, Sherry, like me to help you?
Yes, please. That'd be great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Roger Mark, and Megan, and the team here, including Tom, our West Point fellow this afternoon. And that's a good lead-in for me to the 2 missions I feel I have with you this afternoon. And the first is, since I see many people in this room who are embarking on their career, I want to encourage you to think about this field of energy and climate change as one where you will devote your energies. Ruth began with an analogy, very apt, I think, in many ways, to Cold War era arms control regime and the analogy to solving the climate challenge that is probably the most serious challenge we face to global security today. And when I was embarking on my career, quite a long time ago now, during the Cold War, it seemed to me that the threat of a nuclear war, a nuclear attack, was the most serious global challenge we faced. And so that's what I wanted to work on. And I spent much of my career working on nuclear weapons and arms control and those hard security challenges. And I have, my career has evolved in a way so that now I work on those plus climate security and energy challenges. And I believe these are the most challenging matters that we have to face today, and we need really smart young people to get into this field and to help develop more of this silver buckshot that we're talking about today. So the second part of my mission here today is to tell you a little bit about the CNA Military Advisory Board and the work we've been doing. I founded this organization as part of CNA back in 2007, organizing now over 30 generals and admirals, retired 3 and 4 stars mostly, who have devoted their military leadership and experience to addressing this global security challenge. And we've tried to reframe the debate about climate change into one about climate security and one about the challenges that we face globally in a security context. And we have done that to a large extent. It's been taken up very seriously throughout the national security community in the U.S. and around the world. We started in 2007 with a report called National Security and the Threat of Climate Change, identifying climate change as a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world, and identifying that climate change would add to tensions even in stable regions, that it's a threat to U.S. national security, and that climate, energy, and national security are an interrelated set of challenges. And since that report was released, it was immediately, portions of it were immediately enacted into the Defense Authorization Bill, and since 2008, the Defense Department and the intelligence community have been addressing the national security implications of climate change in the National Security Strategy, Defense Strategy, Military Strategy, Quadrennial Defense Review, and various national intelligence assessments. We have, in the interim, done a series of 3 reports, and I didn't bring all of the reports. The most recent one is out there. There are probably not enough copies of that, but they're all available on our website. We've done a series of 3 reports on energy-related challenges, energy and national security, powering America's economy, and transportation challenges that all form, in some ways, the basis for the second half of this talk. But we recently released this update to the first report. We did it here at the Wilson Center upstairs in the big auditorium with your president, Jane Harmon, and Roger Mark, and a number of our military advisory board members, identifying that now climate risks are indeed accelerating. Not only is it a threat multiplier, but a catalyst for conflict. It's not a future threat, it's here today. And it's no longer an option for us to wait and see. And that the U.S. needs to take a more global effort at leadership to develop sustainable and energy-efficient solutions to address the climate challenge. And both the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, Kerry and Hagel, in their own remarks, have addressed the climate security threat, relying on the work that we've done. Now, to address the sort of silver buckshot element of this, because I spent many years in DOD in the 90s addressing both environmental and climate challenges in a way that would have relevance to a military warfighter. And to be able to say, okay, this matters to conducting the mission. And in so doing, I often had to reframe what we were talking about, not to even to use the word environment. Sometimes I used, we did one study where we called it reducing the fuel consumption for warfighters. And reducing the right, and that was all about, essentially that was after the 97 Kyoto climate change negotiations, where we realized that the military was going to have to deal with greenhouse gas emissions at some point, and that was all related to energy use. and that energy use was about how much fuel you used to the war fight. So if you could take less fuel to the fight, you'd be reducing that burden. You could spend money on something else, and at the same time, you'd have the collateral benefit, we kind of said it was a secondary benefit, of reducing your greenhouse gas emissions. So in some ways, for the purpose of this discussion, the Department of Defense is really a sort of microcosm of change that can be made across the economy, across our nation, and in some ways globally. It's the nation's largest industrial organization. It is the nation's single largest energy user, although, to be fair, it's a small energy user. It's 1.7% of total U.S. fuel consumption. So we frame this for the Defense Department in a way that you can increase operational energy and operational efficiency and effectiveness by focusing on how you use energy. And there are a number of examples here, and it's a whole talk, and I'm not going to go into this now, but there are a couple of buckets here that I've identified from efficiency, and a lot of those go to how you change your weapon systems, which the military is changing out, moving to, say, hybrid electric drives, or moving to ship stern flaps, all of which sort of reduce energy use and give you smarter weapon systems or improved engines, everything to microgrids, or changing your building standards. Then there's the bucket of renewables. And indeed, today, the military is developing renewables both to power its own platforms and serving as a test bed to develop renewables for broader use across the economy, wind and solar. And then there are alternative fuels, alternative biofuels. The military is very actively developing alternative fuels for its weapon systems. And all of this is not initially about reducing its carbon footprint. That's a sort of secondary benefit. It's all about improving operational efficiency, reducing the amount of fuel and water that our troops have to carry to the front. You may have seen in the first slide that iconic poster from World War II, "Man your stations," oil is ammunition. So we've gone from an era in which, fuel was power to an era in which, for the military in Iraq and Afghanistan, having to convoy fuel to the front was putting the lives of our soldiers at risk. So we want to change those behaviors. This I'm really not going to go into, but just suffice it to say, if you were working in DoD today, you'd have these variety of tools available to you to develop some of these different ways of procuring energy, buying energy, and increasing energy efficiency across the range of activities. They're not perfect, but they're all there. And a little bit like Elke's talk about what's the default assumption. Many of these tools, most of which were around when I was in DoD in the 90s, are very good, but if you don't have a penalty for not using them, then often you default to I'll just stick with my old incandescent bulb, which I often found I had a lot of mandates for putting in more hybrid electric and fuel-efficient non-tactical vehicles at DoD. But if the Army, Air Force, and Marine Corps, Navy, Marine Corps, who had to buy them every year, didn't face any penalty for not buying them, they just say, "Oh, well, I didn't meet the goal." So that's very much an example of how you have to think about not only what tools you have, but also what behavior. Another way, a couple other important considerations are the leadership commitment, and I think we've seen increasing commitment across the Department of Defense from the Secretary to many of our military leaders. The commander of Pacific Command, Admiral Locklear, has said the climate security challenges is the most serious threat he faces in the Pacific today. We have many leaders committed to addressing the operational energy challenge across the services. There's a very active memorandum of understanding with the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense now to develop those innovative technologies and practices, and it could include some of these behavioral approaches that you all work on. And the military has shown itself to be, over many decades now, a great laboratory or institution for cultural change across many sectors. And we can go back and think to both integration, racial integration in the military, integration of women, the gays in the military. Now, the military hasn't always been the leading institution, but it is a reflection of where our country is headed, and it's a large institution. And so when it does change, it can make a big difference. I recall under my time at Defense, one of the changes we made was to declare the Department of Defense in the early 90s a smoke-free workplace. And that was a huge change to make millions declare Department of Defense facilities no smoking for millions of working Americans. And that's a vast cultural change. If you go back, again, iconic pictures of, the sailor with the pack of cigarettes in the T-shirt in World War II. So there is an opportunity now as we are in the middle of an energy transformation in our nation. We are in the middle of that transformation. The way we power our economy, ourselves, our society will be different when my kids, some of whom are about the age of some of you in this room, are my age, and that will be great. It will be, and it will look different. We'll have driverless cars, and we'll have a whole bunch of things we can't even imagine yet. And we'll have drones delivering our packages. So those are all. That's a force for good. And then finally, I'd say on the resilience front, which is very important in the near term, developing more resilience to the effects of climate change occurring today, extreme weather events, droughts, fires, making our communities resilient to withstand those disasters in many regions of the country will be aided by a strong partnership of the military with the local community. And that's my final message. I like this because it kind of captures sort of what, in a way, all the things that we're trying to do to leave the world a better place. And you can decide what you want to call it. But if you do any of those things, we'll all come out ahead.
Great. Thank you very much, Sherry. Very good to have a sense of CNA's work around climate security and getting a sense of what it means to reframe these issues. If you're talking to a military warfighter, what does this mean in terms of how you communicate and engage? And looking at questions around operational efficiency for the DoD and thinking about questions like penalties and leadership and how this all comes together. So I think overall, from the panelists, we've had a framing and a series of ideas for us to think about, then a discussion around the behavioral bullet, and then leading us to think about operational efficiency and the military. So let's open it up. This is being recorded, so my colleagues will come to you with the microphone. If you have a question, just raise your hand and we'll ask you to give your name and your affiliation, please. So any questions, comments, thoughts, reactions? Yes, please. Up front here.
Yeah, I'm Jed Schilling with the Millennium Institute and the Mountain Institute, and I've done a lot of work on these environmental issues and found this all very, very interesting. I think on Ruth's presentation, it's nice looking at the nuclear relationship, although all countries didn't need nuclear power the way all countries need energy. And I think another model that would be good to bring in was the ozone agreement in Montreal, because that brought together people to agree on some significant changes. And I know some people who participated in that and said how much Kyoto had changed in the way governments participated in those kinds of things. And I think that one of the challenges we face on this is the economics of short-term gains that so many companies are trying to do, like power generation companies, and things like contractors who build houses with minimal insulation. and then the energy bill goes on to the owner. And this is another case where the regulation ought to require the builder to cover the costs of additional energy and things like that. So I think we need to do more of these buckshots and aim them at really the people who are making the bad decisions for their own profit or own benefit or something like that. And the other thing is the work I did with Millennium Institute. We did a global model for the world, for UN environmental program in their green economy report that showed how global investment changes would be very beneficial. But the thing that became very clear, as a number of you have commented on, is that the countries have to make their own decisions and policies. And given the impacts of climate change and environmental preservation, some countries have to do nearly the opposite thing of other countries in terms of managing water. Some very poor countries need more energy, not cutting down their use of energy like we do and things like that. So it's very important to get these small groups out addressing these particular issues and providing the right incentives to do so. But it was really a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ruth, any thoughts and comments, sort of this question of, looking at short-term gains? Sherry talked a little bit about penalties in terms of motivation to get things going. A sense is as we look across a range of countries, a set of the buckshot approach for one country might be different for another country.
Can I just speak into this?
Sure, yes.
Okay. I didn't know whether I had to turn something on. This horizons issue is such an interesting issue because, if you look at the polls, an awful lot of Americans think that climate change is a serious problem, but they don't prioritize it. And, the thing that I've struggled with and what led me in part into the work that I'm doing with ELCA is this problem of horizons, that what we're asking people to do is to invest now for people they may never meet, for people who are even faceless to them, because much of the investment now becomes a benefit to future generations. And it's very hard for people to imagine that, you can imagine your children, and maybe you can imagine your grandchildren if you stick around and get to know them, but you have a much harder time imagining your grandchildren's children, right? And that's the time horizon we're talking about. But Elke might have something to say about that too, because it's really very much about how we're wired as people and behaviorally how we think about problems.
Yeah, may just add to Ruth's remarks. I think just because we have a behavioral diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean the solution should be just behavioral. I think so in many situations, finding that people might either have too much risk aversion, or might not have sort of the long-term time horizon to make the energy efficiency decisions on their own, or we have other things to worry about. Worry about our marriage, worry about our job, rather worrying about energy consumption. What that might mean is we need to have new institutions, and so GE maybe shouldn't be selling refrigerators, they should be selling refrigeration services, and they come into our home and replace the model with a new update down the road. So transfer sort of the risk and transfer the cost to institutions, to entities that might be less risk averse, might be more rational. And so I think the same holds also at the international level. I think sort of there might be the same diagnosis at sort of the human processing level, but the solution might be very different from in a developing country than in a developed country.
Yes. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Joe Browder. I just wanted to suggest that this efficiency paradox discussion is not that relevant to this debate. In the United States, for years, the policy people who've worked on this have already done what you're suggesting now, gone to the institutions. The levels of efficiency of the appliances that any homeowner has a choice of buying now are so much greater than existed 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and improving all the time. And the environmental community, NRDC, to some extent EDF, Institute for Market Transformation, others have focused on these institutions, have been extraordinarily successful. And whether you're talking about the amount of energy per per computer that we use, per refrigerator we have, per television set we own. And this is global. It's not just in the United States. There's no such thing as an efficiency paradox, and we're not going anywhere because of it. We're making tremendous strides on efficiency, and the IT industry, the Cisco's and Qualcomm's and the French company Schneider Electric are about to pull us into a new era of even greater efficiencies. So I think if you check with the people who are actually doing the work, you'll find the world is a much more hopeful place than you might have indicated.
Well, can I
Please,
I'm
yeah,
going
go
to
ahead.
push back a little bit on that. I agree with you. We are getting more efficient, but you know, there's a lot of work being done, and Elke can talk about this better than I can, about labeling, because basically ultimately it's about consumers making decisions, and sometimes the kind of information that they can process and understand. I mean, not all these new appliances are efficient. Some of them are, and some of them aren't. You know. I had an interesting thing happen to me a week or so ago where I came across an article about somebody at at LBL in Berkeley who had worked for, I don't know, 6 years on, you know, when you work in an institution, including the Wilson Center, you're really encouraged to never turn your computer off. And the real reason our really terrific IT guy explained to me is because they add patches at night, and if you turn your computer off and the patch, there has to be a reset, and this happens to me sometimes, and people get angry when they come in to work, and if they had turned off the computer, for example. If they come into work and then in the middle of trying to write a document or answer an email, it goes into a reset. What this guy developed was technology that basically, I can't explain it, okay, but it was to basically put computers into a form of sleep mode that was wakened. The technology would wake the computer, put in the patch, and then go back to sleep again. I called him up out of the blue, and we had a long conversation, and we've been talking a lot since then. I've been connecting with other people who might be interested in pursuing these ideas, but it wasn't, this was offered, the software was offered to Microsoft and to Apple. Apple actually put it in, and for a long time it was turned off, and people could turn it on if they want to, if they knew about it. Now Apple is providing it with it turned on, so the default is it's on, and you can turn it off if you don't like it. Microsoft declined to pick it up. My only point, without belaboring it, is yeah, we're making efficiency gains, but there's so much more out there we could be doing. A lot of stuff. This guy estimated when he first started working on it that it just adopted within the United States, it could save $2 billion. He thinks that's a lower number these days because computers have become more efficient, but it's still a pretty big number. So I'm not arguing with you that there isn't progress. There is progress, but I think there are a lot of other barriers to progress that exist, and we have to figure out how to deal with that.
We just sort of add to that a couple of sentences. I think sort of how well we do, ours is a question of benchmarks, right? And so, yeah, absolutely we're doing better. The question is how much better could we be doing? We don't always have these comparisons. But then the other point to make is I just used the energy efficiency as an example, of the kind of barriers, to sort of more productive behavior. So certainly sort of none of what I said hinges on that particular example. And we see similar barriers to adaptive or to mitigative behavior in many other contexts.
So I wanted to ask the panel a little bit about one of the issues that we work on here at the Wilson Center, which are questions around population. And I was quite struck when we helped Sherry launch a report, and we asked your advisory board what was different between the 2007 report and your current report. And the first thing that members of your advisory board said was population. And I know we're talking about behavior and consumption consumption and choices. Brian O'Neill has done an analysis looking at these stabilization wedges that you spoke about, Elke, and he showed that reducing population growth could help bring down 16 to 29% of the reduction needed to stabilize emissions, that it could be one of these wedges. And his analysis has very specifically looked at behavioral change around fertility decisions and women's empowerment. And I wonder whether you could comment a little bit about how you see this fitting in, given that the Military Advisory Board has said population dynamics is important. I know that Ruth, you and I have spoken about the role of women and women's empowerment in this context, and then Elke thinking a little bit about this as a stabilization wedge. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I've been asked a question like this before, Roger. And what's the most important thing we could do globally to address the challenge of climate change? And I basically said, educate more women around the planet, because once women are educated, they will make decisions about fertility. We've seen that in every developing nation, that birth rates go down and empowerment goes up, and so that's really where we need to start, and that's the biggest difference that one could make in this entire equation.
There's really nothing I could add to that. That's absolutely right. And there's so much strong evidence on it. That's what's really interesting.
I think maybe one caution is, that in the arena of climate change, we need a pretty dramatic action fairly soon.
Right.
And the question is whether we have the latitude, to wait for the education of women and the equalization of wealth around the world, to bring about the changes that we need.
Yes. Please.
Hi, my name is Jean Boucher. I'm with George Mason University Sociology. I guess this is for Elke. So in some of my research, I've come up with what I call the German exception, which is a sort of a developed country that is very concerned about the environment and CO2 emissions and that kind of a thing. And whereas I think the U.S. is on the other end of the spectrum. And since you have your feet in both countries, this is kind of a personal question. You've mentioned institutions, and I think we're going to have to institutionalize either formally or informally. And I think Germany has a high degree of informal institutions. Like a friend of mine recently came back and said, it's very easy to live a low carbon lifestyle in Germany. It's all sort of set up for it. So I guess maybe your own personal reflections when you come to the US and you have to come up with all these interesting words to avoid engaging sort of these ideologies that are going to get people nervous. How do you, I don't know, should I explain myself more? Can you?
No, I know exactly what you mean. And remember I talked at some point about the importance of context in priming the kinds of values that you need to make these sort of more long-term focused and more socially focused kinds of decisions. I think one thing that you see in Europe and have seen for a long time is just much stronger population density. And so it tends to be frontier nations, like the United States, like Australia, sort of who have these sort of more libertarian and individual-focused social values, And so I think part of is population density, and then also related to that, the social norms that have developed, And so, what is chronically active, are the kinds of values, as a child in Germany, you're being told, that sort of your behavior is being watched by everyone around you. I don't think American kids grow up that way. So I think this is like another point to additional behavioral interventions, tools that I didn't even bring up. Most of my tools had to do with cognition because I'm a cognitive psychologist. Had to do with attention, had to do with sort of priming the right kind of values. But yes, I think certainly social norms, the kind of child rearing practices that we have, that sort of chronically activate different subsets of values in different cultures in different countries, I think are very important. And also to Sherry's point is these kinds of interventions have to work in unison. And so it's not good to have just put the right kind of default in place if the economic incentives are not there for you to come through with it. Or if your fear of the technology prevents you from doing doing that. So I think we have to sort of align both motivations and the aids to better cognitive processing in ways that sort of pull along the same lines and pull on the same string. And learn from other countries. Yeah. So what is it? I mean, your question is dead on. What is it about Germany, or what is it about some other country where we can learn?
I wanted to build a little bit on that before we get to your question. So you're coming from George Mason. I think you were here yesterday at our Smart Cities event. Thank you. 2 days in a row. Thank you. I wanted to build on Sherry's comment on students. I just recently came back from the large association meeting of international educators, and these are faculty and staff at university administrators who are working at internationalizing curricula on campuses throughout the United States. So 10,000 university administrators working on this. And they specifically asked me to come in and talk about climate security and why this was important to internationalization of education. And this is both educating U.S. students for this. It's more than study abroad. It's about getting it into the curriculum, but also bringing foreign students to U.S. universities who then get exposed to these ideas and then go back to assume positions of leadership in their countries. So I wonder, Alki, you work a lot with students. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how do these issues all fit in? Sherry, you say this is a sort of critical issue today for young people. Is there a role for us to be putting this more in international education efforts at universities and campuses here and abroad? Any thoughts? That's one that you may not have thought of before.
You get me stumped.
Yeah.
Well,
what are you hearing from students?
Well, I think being aware of our consequences on the environment is definitely a generational issue. I mean, if you look at just even polling, and I think that's true across the world. And it makes sense, from any kind of perspective, as a sociological perspective, evolutionary perspective, young people are more concerned, about the future of the planet because they're going to be around for a lot longer. It's going to impact them a lot more. And so, yes, there's no question that sort of among the young generation, there's a huge concern. There's also a huge anxiety about the issue, which is something that we need to address. I think another talking about the contrast between cognition and motivation, there's an emotional element, and I think sort of one of the reasons why we as individuals frequently sort of fail to take action on these sort of large social issues like climate change, it just feels so overwhelming. What can an individual do? And so you might actually realize that action needs to be taken, but you don't see our politicians are not doing it, our institutions are not doing it. Sort of what can you as an individual do? It just seems like so overwhelming that it actually makes, in some sense, it might not be rational, but it makes sense to switch channels and to turn away. And to some extent, we're all climate change deniers. And when we go home on a Friday night, we don't want to deal with this issue. We want to do something that's much more life-affirming. And so I think helping people figure out what are the actions that we can take as individuals, whether that means voting, whether that means having fewer kids, or whether that means sort of turning off the lights, or buying different kinds of refrigerators. That might not make a difference for an individual, but if you multiply it by 200 million, or by 3 billion, it does make a difference. And again, sort of not getting people to just do a single thing, because one of the other phenomena that's around is called the rebound effect, and you probably have come across this. That oftentimes the argument is, well, it might not be so good to educate people sort of to do this one thing that's good for the environment, because as soon as we've done that, the flag goes down. That sort of something's out of whack, and basically we gave at the office, and now we can actually sort of go on this nice vacation, or buy this sort of bigger car. Well, again, that's an educational issue, right? And that's sort of that it's not a silver buckshot, not a silver bullet in terms of an individual action, but you need to actually sustain this approach, or help people not themselves sustain it, but put institutions in place that will do it for them. And all they have to do is sort of vote for the right kind of group or join the right kind of organization that helps them achieve those objectives.
Yes.
Can I add something?
Please, yes.
Did you want to share it? No.
I just say the fact that Tom at West Point and others like him can take classes, in this was not true 15, 20 years ago. So I think that, and in colleges and universities today, it's already substantially integrated into the curriculum. I mean, Look, when we were in law school, they didn't
There
even
was-
teach environmental law,
Yeah.
and that wasn't that long ago.
And, you know, I think a lot of really interesting constructive things are happening on campus right now
Yes.
because kids are trying to figure out what to do about this, but the whole, you can, you know, debate it for hours, but the whole disinvestment issue
Yeah.
is really student-led. I mean, it's
Yeah.
really kids who have decided they're gonna push on this issue. There's been a lot of pressure on universities in other ways to be more energy efficient, to find different ways of operating. So it interests me, you know, I used to worry, I still do to some extent, why aren't people in the streets demanding the Congress? Why wasn't this like the Civil Rights Movement or the Vietnam period or something like that? It just isn't, but I do, my exposure to kids on campuses, they're just sort of almost like taking it in their own hands and trying to find things that they can personally do to affect this.
Okay, good. Yes, please. If you can get a microphone. Thank you. Your name and affiliation.
My name is Vivian Alexander, and I'm a summer intern over at the NSF. And
You're from Trinidad,
yeah, Trinidad and
Sorry.
Tobago.
as I am.
Actually, I'm a graduate student, and my dissertation is actually on sustainability. But I think you asked my exact question because in my research, what we're finding is that, you know, students aren't the information they know about these kind of issues, the information that they actually got from their faculty members and their teachers. And apart from that, they aren't really aware about those issues. And those issues are concentrated in certain areas such as like engineering, agriculture, where these issues are important. But in other areas like education, you know, philosophy, stuff like that, you know, it doesn't come up. So what we have is that we have generations of students that are graduating. They show a concern about it, but they don't really know much about the issue itself. So, you know, I just wanted, well, you basically answered, asked the question and provided answers, but you know, it's just really a need to broaden, to, you know, go further than just engineering or agriculture, but all aspects. And I don't think, based on what I've been finding, is that, you know, kind of it's lacking in those areas for other disciplines.
Great, thank you, especially for small island developing states like Trinidad. I think we have another comment here.
Hi, I'm Bill Christensen. I'm with an organization called Mission Readiness, which doesn't have anything directly related to this. But I have a quick comment and then a question. My comment is for Ruth. You were talking about how we need to be able to imagine what's going to happen, not just to our children and our grandchildren and our grandchildren's children, but on the same hand, I mean, the drought that's happening in the Mesopotamia, Syria region very much contributed to the instability that is now, you know, running amok in Syria and even in Iraq, on into Iraq. So the idea that we're not facing immediate consequences from climate change, I think, you know, there's a lot of farmers in Texas that are, and I think, you know, it's important that we recognize that instability is happening now, and it's not just in Darfur or places that don't matter so much to us. So that's sort of a comment. So it's sort of fairly obvious. But my question is on the silver buckshot idea, research, investment in research, and the international buckshot. It seems to me that, you know, the type of investing in things like graphene or nuclear, you know, options, and the international cooperation between the United States and China that's happening in some intriguing ways that almost no one sort of looks at. Those are some really interesting buckshots that may pay off in very important ways.
I mean, I completely agree. I think there actually are. I didn't want to make this too black and white because, frankly, I think that's where things are moving gradually. And I agree with you that there have been these pretty horrific weather incidents. The problem is we've always had weather, you know, and there's a second problem which I've come to think about recently, which is this whole issue of the new normal. You know, for you this is not normal, but maybe for another generation this becomes normal, and that makes it much harder to address these issues.
It reminds me of a comment that I made yesterday. We were talking about smart cities and Superstorm Sandy. And I was in Bangladesh when Superstorm Sandy hit. And my Bangladeshi partner said, I don't know what's wrong with you Americans. We face a Superstorm Sandy every day. That was their reality. Please.
I think it was Ruth Bell who mentioned the Paul Krugman piece, which was about the Henry Paulson piece, which was about risk. And it reminded me that one interesting phenomenon in the last 2 years on this whole issue has been the increasing evidence of the insurance industry as being very interested in this. And I'm wondering if there are other similar corporate with respect to the insurance industries, is there anything that can be done to make their concerns more everybody concerns? And also, are there other, since most of us don't think of insurance as very, very friendly, and also, are there other corporate sectors that may have leverage like the insurance company in these problems?
So risk.
Other kinds of buckshot.
I mean, well, the military frames these, the whole security community uses a risk management framework. And, you know, we identified even in our very first report, you know, that the approach to risk in the national security sphere is, you know, you don't wait till you know you have 100% certainty of a threat. If you wait, something bad is going to happen on the battlefield. That's a approximate quote from General Sullivan, the first chairman of the Military Advisory Board. So I think there are other industries today, industry sectors that are beginning to have similar awareness, certainly those that provide from chemicals to industrial services and transportation, particularly global transportation services. Right, yeah, supply chain, very much aware of the risks of climate change.
Great, please.
Go ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I just want to say very fast that the report that Krugman was commenting on by Henry Paulson, which I haven't read the report yet, it's just coming out, but if you read the op-ed by Paulson, he's picked up exactly the frame that Sherry and the generals have been emphasizing, which is the risk frame. You know, he says it's not an issue of certainty, it's an issue of risk, and then he looks at the fat tail, and he says that's really worrying, and that's what the insurance companies look at, the fat tail. So I think that this is starting to get some real currency and some momentum, thank goodness.
And just to add, the insurance industry and the reinsurance industry in particular has long been interested in climate change. Yeah, and you know, you could argue think that it will bankrupt them down the road because risks are no longer independent. You know, with these global challenges. But you know, in terms of tools, one thing that was actually tried as an experiment in the United States the last couple of years was risk-based insurance premiums. Yeah, in particular on flood insurance. And you know, to everybody's surprise, Congress passed this a couple of years ago, and then Sandy happened. Yeah. And just recently, Congress retrenched on that. Yeah, and passed very, very quickly. And so you have this issue of moral hazard, with organizations like FEMA that come in time and time again to replace damages, in areas where probably nobody should be settling. Yeah, so this brings up the issue of retrenchment. Yeah, Holland is giving up on some of its land. Yeah, so again to your point about Europe being much more progressive on these dimensions, and saying, well, we just cannot afford to defend these stretches of coastal settlement, and let's move to higher lying areas.
Any final comments, thoughts? Yes, please.
My name's Chandler Weiland. I'm with the Magic of Reality Project, and I found every presenter's presentation to be fabulous. I just have a comment on Elke's, not that her presentation needs any support, especially from me, but it's that labeling, how decisions some of us become compulsive readers. I don't think I'm a compulsive reader because I can definitely bypass every ad. However, I had 2 cars. They were the same model. It was an XJ6. I got them on eBay. Part of my California bringing up, reuse. So the first one, Hello Kitty, was my primer, and I learned quickly I needed a mechanic, and the mechanic made me aware quickly I needed 2, one to fix and one to drive. So so the second one, Peace Out, because I'm a girl, we name things, was a little bit upgraded from Kitty because it had the opportunity to make me aware of my fuel usage. And so one of the mechanics, they, got a kick out of me because I was so goofy, asked me if I would like to know what my fuel consumption was, and I was elated. I had no idea I had this. I was bummed out I didn't have heated seats. But this made up for it. And after about 6 months, I had to take it in a lot, they were so joyful that it seemed that I was using this tool, because when I brought it in, the things, I had just gotten it. It had 14 miles per gallon, and after 6 months, I was doing 24 miles per gallon, and they said they had never known anybody get more than 20 miles per gallon. And I know that myself, if I dipped to 23 miles per gallon, I wondered, did I need to step on it? Or did I, So I am a firm believer in labels, and I thought, I gasped at that woman reducing carbon, the carbon footprint between her and her husband, because I do know somebody that I would like to do that too.
I'm not advertising this.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, and please join me in thanking our panel. So just so that you know, for future reference, this has been recorded. We will put it on our website, so that's available to you. The PowerPoint presentations will also be there. We'll write up a short summary and probably do a podcast coming out of it. So please visit our website at wilsoncenter.org and our blog at newsecuritybeat.org to access those materials. Thanks so much.